Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad you're here. This is part 3 of our discussion on food apartheid. So, if you recall, we introduced the topic a few weeks ago. I think by now it's been about a month. And we talked about what food apartheid is, what it isn't, why we use the term food apartheid instead of some of these other food terms that you might know about, things like food insecurity, food desert. They don't really get to the heart of the matter. And so we talked a lot about why food apartheid was more appropriate for discussing food issues and food disruptions and problems that you might see when you're trying to get food to the table. And in the second episode about food apartheid, we spent our time in the United States, right? That's where I'm from, it's where I live. And I wanted to share with you some of the issues that we have in the United States that relate to food apartheid. Things like our U.S. Department of Agriculture and how they deal with their money and how they discriminate with the support and their policies. And I talked about prison labor and how U.S. companies, big corporations exploit prison labor, exploit the people who are incarcerated for their own personal interests, and they pump out food that is unhealthy at very low prices because they're using prison labor to do so. It's really an interesting way to take advantage of our criminal justice system. And so we talked a little bit about that. And then supermarket redlining. So it was a new term for me, but it makes sense when I drive around looking for a supermarket. You know the good cities with the nice supermarkets. You know the ones with the bad supermarkets or with none at all. And so you can see clearly from how cities are laid out, how things are planned, that certain people get access and certain people do not get access to healthy food through supermarkets, grocery stores, fresh markets, farmers markets, all those things. And so we talked a little bit about that in the second episode. And I promised, and I'm here for part 3 because I want to talk about food apartheid all around the world because it exists all across the globe. It's not just in the developed countries. It's not just on the Western Hemisphere. It's not just in the Northern Hemisphere. It's all over. And so on this episode, I want to spend some time talking about food apartheid around the world and specifically why we see it. Because I would argue that the reasons for the food issues around the world are different than what you might find in any particular developed country. And so let's talk about that. Let's spend some time and think through what's going on with food around the world. So that's what we're going to do on this episode of the podcast. Stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph. Thank you so much for listening. We are talking about food apartheid, and we're talking about food apartheid all around the world. It's all around the world. There's no reason to think that there isn't a place on this planet where this inequity, where there's injustice in the food system. There is injustice and inequities all over the world when it comes to food. We need to be very clear about that. We need to think through why that is, and we need to really be critical of what is upholding these unjust systems that cause people to not get the food that they need. We have to talk about that. So, just to begin the discussion, I want you all to be aware that the United Nations has 17 sustainable development goals, right? They want the world, the whole globe, to develop and to be sustained in ways that are helpful for the people and that allow for people's lives to be enhanced and for them to flourish. And they have goals like ending poverty and having clean water for everyone and education and just governments and all kinds of reforms to help all nations achieve a level of dignity, human rights, and access to resources to help their families, help their cities, their villages, their countries flourish. And so it's not surprising that the second goal they have is a world free from hunger by 2030. That is the goal, to end hunger, to achieve global food security, to improve nutrition, to promote sustainable agriculture. They don't want anybody to be hungry anywhere in the world. And that is their sustainable development goal as it relates to food across the world. And surprise, we haven't even come close to meeting that goal. And, I wish I could just say it's simply a matter of providing the right amount of aid and assistance. I wish we could say it's just a matter of allowing other aspects of these countries to develop in ways that will allow for these food systems to be robust and strong to support the people that live there. But we can't say that because it's not true. It's not true at all. There are so many variables and factors and issues that feed into the reality that food is simply not available for everyone. And it's not because of the people that live there. It's not because there's a lack of resources, not because we need to grow more or produce more. It's because we have systems in place and nations with their own agendas that are harming and disrupting and hurting the people who need the most help to achieve food security. And so, unlike the United States, where we have these kind of policy decisions that drive the way food is distributed and how aid is provided to people who need it, on the global stage, as you might imagine, there's a lot more people involved, a lot more countries involved. There are a lot more issues involved and different competing interests involved. And so, because of that, it's going to be really difficult to achieve any measure of global food security, to deal with these food apartheid instances that we see across the world. And so, we need to talk about that because it is something that, without having our eyes open, we might be looking to the wrong places to get solutions to these issues. So I have 2 C's that I believe are the reason that there is food apartheid around the world. 2 C's. I got 1, conflict. Conflict. The second one is the climate. The climate. I'm going to say conflict and climate. So let's start with conflict. How many conflicts are there in the world? I mean, there's so many. I mean, I don't know if you're even keeping track. If you watch the news for a couple of minutes, if you flip through your favorite social media platform for a few minutes, you'll see the conflicts. You'll see images from Russia and Ukraine. You'll see images from Gaza and the West Bank. You'll see images from Sudan. You'll see images from the Congo. You'll see images from all these places where just war is happening at the moment. And what's interesting about conflict is that when you're in a battle, when you're in a fight, you don't typically fight fair. You don't typically follow the rules because you want to win, because you believe your cause is just and you will do whatever it takes to win whatever the fight is. That's why just about every single warring party that I just mentioned has been accused of war crimes. All of them. Every single one. Now, I don't believe they're all the same. I don't believe each of these warring parties are equally criminal, but everybody's trying to win. And so they're fighting. And because they're fighting, And because they're warring, a lot of what happens is the systems and the resources that are needed to survive are cut off to try to cripple your opponent, to cripple the group you're trying to fight against. So farms get destroyed, factories, things that produce food get seized. Ports, imports, exports get cut off because that's the lifeline for anyone trying to survive in the middle of a conflict zone. Humanitarian aid gets restricted. How many stories have you read about humanitarian aid vehicles, aid trucks, aid workers being killed in a conflict because people do not want you to get food? People do not want you to get water. And so all these things, these conflicts fuel the food crisis around the globe. They fuel the food apartheid systems that exist in the world. And they fuel the hunger and the famine and the dispossession of people's land and property, which many around the world use for their food. That's what these wars do. That's what these conflicts bring about. And the reason it's important to think about it and talk about it is because these nations can't wage war on their own. They don't have the capacity. They don't have the financial standing to continually fight these battles. Russia gets support from China and other nations. The warring parties in the Sudan, they're funded and backed by different large, rich countries. And look, we don't have to talk about Israel and Palestine. We already know. We've talked about it on the podcast many times. Israel is funded by us, the United States. Billions and billions and billions of dollars to wage war in the occupied territories. Hamas, the fighters that are in different Palestinian territories, they get funding from, I think Iran is the big one. Other smaller countries are trying to pitch in, but they can't, it's not the same. And you can even tell by the death toll and the destruction that it's not the same. It's not the same. And so all of these conflicts, all of them, there's a conflict in Haiti right now. There are gangs running rampant all across the capital, all across the country, trying to take over the airport, take over all of the civil structures. There's a new prime minister trying to bring peace with a Kenyan peacekeeping mission. It's not going so well. Where are these gangs getting their funding from? They're not selling cookies at a bake sale. They're getting massive amounts of money, weapons, protection from rich people, primarily in the United States, to fuel their fight against the Haitian government and against the people trying to bring peace and order to the country. That's what's happening. These conflicts fuel this. So people in Haiti are hungry. Where's the food coming from? They can't get any. Nobody's selling food at the store, at the market. Where are you going to get food in Sudan? You're not going to get any. There's a famine. People are hungry, starving. Children are dying. In Gaza, where's the food coming from? They've cut off the humanitarian aid. Only a little bit gets in. There's hundreds and hundreds of trucks waiting to get in. Israel's restricting them from coming in to provide food. There's a famine there. The World Food Program says so. All the human rights organizations say so. It's a big problem. It's a big problem because of the conflict. That's what happens when you have conflict. Food gets restricted. The systems, whoever has the power, whoever has the authority, whoever has the bigger guns can keep the rest of you from eating. That's what happens in a conflict zone. That's one of the many reasons why we want peace. Peace in the Middle East. We want a ceasefire. We want civil wars in Sudan to cease. We want strife in the Congo, and we want the gangs in Haiti to put their weapons down. We want people to stop fighting because the people suffer. The people suffer as a result. So whatever gain you're trying to make is at the cost of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. And food is a big part of that, right? Food is a big part. I forgot to talk about Yemen. What about Yemen? I always forget about Yemen. That war's been going on for, I feel like it's a decade. This war's been going on in Yemen. And famine and malnourishment. Every time I open up an article about Yemen, it's famine. It's not a coincidence. And it's not hard to understand why that is. This is what conflict brings. And I don't know what side of whose war you're on or who you're supporting in whatever conflict is going on at the moment. But if you're listening, you have to agree that dying, malnourished children, pregnant women, people who have pre-existing health conditions, the elderly, people in hospitals shouldn't have to pay the price for whatever objective you're trying to achieve with your conflict. I don't know what you're trying to achieve. I don't know what your goal is. But if it's going to cost thousands of lives and people are going to be dead in the street, then you should go back to the house and think of a different way to achieve your objective, whatever it is, instead of this endless cycle of violence. We don't need it. And we don't want it, and we can't afford to have it. We just can't. We need the conflicts to stop. So I mentioned conflicts like ongoing war, but there are other types of conflicts too. There's political conflict. There's other kinds of economic issues, things that will keep places from having what they need. For instance, let's just be clear that most food apartheid systems globally exist within the framework of apartheid in general in those same areas. So I was reading earlier, researching this topic, looking at Myanmar and the Rohingyas, and everybody agrees there's apartheid there. That the Rohingya people are without standing in Myanmar, that they're denied rights, that they're confined and arbitrarily detained and arrested, and they face violence, and all kinds of unjust actions are taken against them. Now, the articles from Amnesty International, from Human Rights Watch, they didn't talk about food apartheid. They talked about apartheid. But I can promise you food is ingrained in that apartheid system, and that there are tiers to the kinds of access that they have depending on who you are. That's how apartheid works. That's how it's always functioned. Right? When there was apartheid in South Africa, same thing when it came to food. Better, higher quality food options for some, lesser, low quality food items for the rest. That's what apartheid means. And it exists in those spaces across society. It's not just economic, it's not just political, it's food, it's everything. It's apartheid. And people agree. The people who research this stuff, the people who investigate, it's apartheid. It's not kind of conflict that is present in a particular area that harms people. Let's do another one. Obviously, it's a touchy subject. People don't want to talk about it. People are afraid of what could happen if you do. But we just have to be honest. We have to be honest and talk about the Palestinian territories and the fact that every credible human rights organization says that in the occupied territories, a system of apartheid exists where one group, Israeli citizens and settlers and nationals, have certain rights and privileges and have their own justice system, whereas the Palestinian inhabitants of the occupied territories do not have those. It is the clearest understanding of apartheid there is. And when it comes to those territories, food is a big part of it. Water is a big part of it. So the land that Palestinians are using to farm and to provide for their families is often confiscated by the government, by settlers, for no reason other than that they're able to do it. They have the power and the authority, and they just take it. And from what I've been reading, things like olive trees, things like grazing animals, the types of things that you would have on a farm, that you would have in a field that you use to sustain your family and your businesses, they're subject to seizure. They're just taken. They're just taken. Which is not the case if you're an Israeli settler that lives in those occupied territories. And it's not me saying that, it's the United Nations saying that, it's Amnesty International saying that, it's Human Rights Watch saying that. These are the organizations that look at that system and call it apartheid. There's even discussion about whether or not the actual state of Israel itself operates an apartheid system. I think the answer is inconclusive, depending on who you talk to. But there's no question about the territories. Nobody's arguing that. And so when you have that kind of a system in place, then you see large numbers of children going hungry. You see families unable to provide for themselves, to get clean water, to get healthy food, to get whatever's required to survive. You see the Gaza Strip completely annihilated. You see it. You see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I know we're at a year of the current war in Gaza. And a year ago, the Hamas organization, regime, group, whatever you want to call them, went across the border and committed some of the most heinous, horrible, brutal, whatever word you can think of, atrocious acts imaginable. They did that on October 7th, 2023. Music festivals. They took hundreds of hostages, killed lots of civilians. So much they did on that day. And there's no person that I know who would say that that was a justified act. No one, even people that I know who are Palestinian, would not say that. Right? I mean, I'm a Christian. I hang out with Christians all the time. We don't condone any kind of violence on that scale for any reason. There's no reason for that. There's none. The problem is, since that day up until now, the response that Israel provided to that attack can't be excused. It can't be. At some point, you're not defending yourself. You're seeking to eliminate a population of people. You're seeking to eradicate a group. And so, I don't want to get into all the details because they're awful details, right? Children, hospitals, schools, churches, life itself has been completely eliminated from Gaza over the last year. The hostages, we want the hostages to go home to their families. They've been dying from the airstrikes and the assaults that have been taking place in Gaza. They won't get out until it's a ceasefire. They won't. They will not get out until there's a ceasefire. And when it comes to food, which is the point of this episode, what are they eating in Gaza? What are they actually eating? What are civilians eating? What are moms feeding their children in Gaza right now? Animal feed. They're finding dirt and they're baking it. And they're drinking water that nobody would even wash their car with. It's so dirty. There's a famine. Their children dying by the thousands from hunger. That's what's happening. There are aid trucks that are sitting outside of Gaza, ready to come into Gaza to distribute the needed aid. Because let's not forget, this area has always, since it existed, relied on humanitarian aid. This is coming in slowly because it's being restricted by the Israeli military. It just is. There's no reason for that. The people that lived there didn't do anything to receive this type of assault. Go after the people who committed the atrocities on October 7th, 2023. Find them, bring them to justice for what they did. Don't go in and kill tens of thousands of civilians. Don't do it. And so, conflict is the first thing that I wanted to bring to your attention as the main driver for food apartheid around the world is conflict. The second thing is the climate. Now, here's the thing about the climate. Nobody wants to acknowledge the reality that what they do in their home, what their country does to provide electricity and to provide food and to provide a certain standard of living would have any impact on anyone else around the world, right? It's just us. We take care of our own. We want to make sure our air is clean, our water is clean. Let's make sure we do. But that's just ridiculous and silly. Climate change affects everyone all around the world, and it compromises the people who have the fewest resources, and it causes the most impact and damage to those areas than to the places who are actually producing the emissions and producing the pollution that's fueling climate change. That's just a fact. It's an absolute fact. And so when you think about the reality that because the weather is changing, seasons are changing in ways that are uncharacteristic, you have more and more hurricanes, more and more floods, more and more tornadoes, more and more earthquakes, more tsunamis, all these extreme weather events. Because you have temperatures that continue to rise, you have a sea level that continues to rise, what do you get? You get vulnerable places inundated with these impacts, unable to provide for themselves, for their families, for their communities. That's what you get. You get communities that are literally underwater. They're underwater. And because of that, and it might not feel as direct as you would like it to be, but food apartheid is completely interwoven with the disproportionate impacts that climate change brings. It's just a fact. It's just a fact. If I'm able to live in my nice, plush home, drive my large emitting vehicle that's powered by fossil fuels, with my home powered by fossil fuels, and everything built around me with materials and processes that are fueled by fossil fuels, pumping literally tons and tons of emissions into the atmosphere, what do you think is going to happen? I'm fine. I'll be fine. I can go inside the house, turn the air conditioning on, and go to the store later. But a lot of people can't do that. A lot of other developing countries rely on agriculture. They rely on their water sources, their water resources. They rely on the environment to facilitate the production of what they need to survive. They need that. And if we disrupt it, if we undermine it by our activities, by the way that we manage things, we are, in a sense, creating that unjust reality for them by our actions. Let's just be clear about that. So don't try and make the case that what goes on in wherever you live is your concern and only your concern, and what happens in other places, well, they need to figure out what they're going to do to provide for their people and for their institutions. Don't do it. Because the climate crisis, the climate emergency that we're currently witnessing, it impacts the most vulnerable the most. I'll give you an easy example. Every fall, there's a hurricane. At least one. Each year, there's been more and more hurricanes. Each year, stronger and stronger hurricanes. Over and over. We just had, here in America, 2 back-to-back Category 5 hurricanes to come through. Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Milton. Hit the same place. Went through the Caribbean, hit us. Now, in America, many of us can evacuate. We can find places to go. Many people can't. Many people are stuck where they are. They don't have resources to get out. They have to ride the storm out and hope for the best when the storm passes and try to figure out what they're going to do with no power, no electricity, no food, no water, nothing. Now, imagine if you were an island in the Caribbean Ocean. Imagine if you're a small country off the coast of some larger nation and a hurricane comes through. What if you're the Bahamas? I teach a class here at Benedict College, and we had presentations about environmental justice issues, and someone presented on climate change and the Bahamas. And he talked about how these hurricanes every year continue to decimate his town in the Bahamas. And it's climate change doing that. It's climate change that's responsible. And so when it comes to food, when it comes to any kind of food production system, every year it's getting disrupted and getting torn down by these events that we in these large, prosperous, developed countries are facilitating by the way we use electricity and energy and how we produce it. We're creating those systems of apartheid. And I know it's hard to hear for a lot of people because you don't want to feel like you're implicated in those realities, but you are. We are, all of us who have the ability to make choices about how we use our energy and how we produce it. Even what we eat, we all have a role to play in dealing with some of these issues. And so, it would be easy on this episode to pick out a certain place around the world and say, look, there's apartheid there, and look, there's food apartheid there, and look what's happening over there. But the reality is, on the global stage, we're all interconnected. And if you live in America like I do, you have the most influence on the global stage. We are what people always want to call us, the leaders of the free world, the largest military, the largest economy, the largest everything. We're also, I think, the largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're the ones who need to step up and recognize that our activities and our actions are a big driver of what we are seeing around the world when it comes to food apartheid, food insecurity, famine, all of those things. So we got to do something about that. We have to be aware of that. We have to acknowledge and push whoever we can push to do things that deal with the climate. Because if we don't, we're going to be literally disrupting and dismantling the ability of lots of nations around the world to provide for their citizens. And so we need to do something. That's all I got. The 2 C's. The two C's responsible for food apartheid around the world, from my perspective, climate and conflict. Conflict and climate. We end those, we might be able to reach that sustainable goal of a world free from hunger by 2030. Right? We might be able to live in a world where there is no hunger for anyone, man, woman, boy or girl, anything, anyone, anywhere will have what they need to eat. That we'll have food security. People will be confident that they'll have their food needs met in a nutritious and sustainable way. If we can end the conflicts, deal with the climate catastrophe, we can potentially get there. That's my charge for everyone listening. Let's end these conflicts. Stop supporting them, stop fueling them, stop enabling them to take place, and let's be serious about the climate and dealing with the impacts that climate change has on these vulnerable communities, these vulnerable countries, these developing nations all around the world. We can do something, and we should do it now. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. I will see you next time.